So this is the first lecture about Descartes, and we want to get a sense of why Descartes is important to pragmatism, because all of the pragmatists are going to react to Descartes in different ways, and Peirce is just the first one we're going to be talking about. So I thought we would start with a very brief discussion of Descartes' project in the Meditations. And this is what Descartes describes, and it's actually very important because, as we'll see, Descartes' dualism between mind and body is one which thinks of those two spheres of experience as being, separated and separable. So his isolation from people and his elimination of bodily cares are both part of the preparation for radical doubt. The next thing we can think of is how the doubt proceeds, and it proceeds in stages. The first stage that he engages in is the stage of doubting what his senses tell him. And we've all had experiences where we've doubted our senses, where we saw something moving and we couldn't quite tell what it was, or we mistook someone for somebody else. And so Descartes' procedure for doubting says that if there's something that can be doubted, even possibly doubted, then it should be doubted. So this is not the standard procedure where you doubt things because, a particular instance is doubtable, but he's thinking about the different ways we come to know things, and he's saying if there's even one exception to the way we know that thing, then that entire class of beliefs can be doubted. So he says in the Meditations, this is not going to be an infinite labor. I'm going to doubt kinds of belief, not particular beliefs, because we have way too many beliefs for that to work. So the doubt is going to be universal. It's going to apply to all things possible. It's going to be methodical. It's going to proceed in a step-by-step way, and it's going to be hyperbolic. You can see that if you look at the stages of doubt, he starts with the senses, and then he says they can sometimes deceive me. And then he moves on, he expands a little bit. He talks about dreams, and he says sometimes even dreams can be confused with waking life. And this is the famous dream argument. And essentially the conclusion that he comes to is that there's no criterion that tells us that we are awake or asleep. There's nothing you can pick out that says this thing is always present. This is the mark of the difference between being awake and being asleep. And so by doubting whether or not he's awake or asleep, or the existence of a criterion that would distinguish those two, he essentially throws into doubt even truth and falsity, because truth and falsity depend on a correspondence for Descartes between what we think and what exists out in the world. So the dream argument doubts the existence of truth and falsity in those sorts of factual senses. He goes ahead and deepens the doubt by thinking about mathematics. Mathematics doesn't rely on the senses, and it doesn't even rely on imagination. It is just the relation of figures and numbers. And this is the point in the hyperbolic doubting procedure where he realizes that there could be an evil genius, sometimes translated as evil demon, that every time I go about the process of thinking even a simple equation like 2 plus 3 equals 5, the evil genius or the evil demon could slip in there and mess me up, like trip up my mind. And so he realizes that if he can come up with an objection even to mathematics, there is at least a possibility, a logical possibility, that the truths of mathematics are doubtable. And so as he comes to the end of the first meditation, he realizes that all of his foundational beliefs have been destroyed because every class of belief, senses, the belief in the difference between being awake and dreaming, and also even in mathematical truths, all foundational beliefs have been destroyed, and hyperbolic doubt has run to the end of the course, and it seems as if there's nothing that he can believe in. So as we come to the second meditation, we find ourselves, or Descartes finds himself, with all of his foundational beliefs destroyed. Every level of belief, as I was saying before, has been destroyed. And he's wondering, is there anything left? Is there anything in which he can believe? How is he going to proceed? Maybe there's nothing true at all. And so this is the question he's asking himself. He's asking, what can I believe? So he surveys the contents of his mind and he says, all right, well, let's not get out of hand here. Maybe there's something in my mind that I can find. And he sort of looks around in his mind as the way you might look around in your garage for a tool that you need. And he surveys the contents of his mind, and he finds in there one idea or one thing that cannot be doubted, and that is the cogito. He realizes that if I'm thinking, I must at least be existing to think, right? He says, I think I exist is true every time I think it. It is a self-verifying belief. In other words, if he says, well, I doubt that, then he at least has to exist to doubt. If he says, I'm thinking falsely, he at least has to think in order to think falsely. So the cogito is an argument in which shows that the cogito is incorrigible, right? It can't be wrong. It's self-verifying, right? Just thinking the claim makes it true, and it's irresistible. In other words, he can't help but give his assent to the idea that this is a convincing truth. He knows that he exists every time that he thinks it. What's left for him to wonder is whether or not he knows what he is, right? He says, okay, I realize that every time I think I have to at least exist to think, but he says, all right, but what am I, this thing that's thinking and self-verifying and so forth? He doesn't know yet. He doesn't know what he is. It could be that he thinks he has a body, he thinks he's in front of a fireplace, but that's just the evil genius getting into his mind. And so this is where he's come in the meditations. He realizes that he is a thing that thinks. He's not sure what else he is. He moves on in meditation 2 to what's sometimes called the wax example. And one of the things he inspects about himself is like, well, what is this thinking that I'm doing? How does it work? And the wax example is meant to illustrate the way that thinking gets a hold of something that is true. And he gives the example of the wax, and he talks about wax that's in front of a fire, and it has certain sensory qualities. It has a certain smell, a certain size, shape, texture, odor. And when you bring it close to the fire, all of those things change, right? Every report that you're getting from your senses changes, and yet you know that it's still the same piece of wax. How do you know that? Well, for Descartes, this is an indication that there's something beyond the senses that knows things, and this is intuition. Intuition, a kind of mental insight, is the source of knowing. It is the source of knowing which is true, which cannot be doubted. So this is the point of the wax example, is it shows him that there's a way that we can think that can get at the truth. Now, at the end of meditation 2, Descartes is asking himself, well, all right, well, fine, I've had these insights about the fact that I'm a thinking thing and that it's intuition which is getting at, what's essential. But what more am I than that? Am I trapped? Is a sort of subjective consciousness trap? Is there a world? How can he even know? And how can he prove it? And so this is where he winds up at the end of meditation 2. So now he's got to get out of this bubble, this subjective bubble that he might be in. He's not sure. And to do that, he needs to prove the existence of some criteria by which he can know what's true and what's false. And he's already supposed that there's an evil genius which can be messing with him. And so he needs to prove that there is no evil genius, no omnipotent evil genius. In other words, he needs to prove that there is something else, that there's something like a God that would not deceive him. So the purpose of meditation 3 is to prove the existence of God. And he does this, again, he does this survey of mental contents, and he goes about classifying his different kinds of mental contents, his mental objects. And so he surveys his mind, and he sees that there are different kinds of thoughts that he has. He sees that there are things which come from within him, there are things which he makes up, and there are things which seem to come from outside of him. Those are different origins for ideas. He sees that some of these ideas may be innate, some ideas may be fictitious, and some ideas may be adventitious. So innate ideas are derived by reflecting on your own nature. Fictitious ideas are invented by us, and adventitious ideas come from outside of us. So by classifying his thoughts, the types of mental content he has, and the origins they might become from, he says, well, what in there is kind of special? He realizes that there is an idea in him that's special, and it's the idea of God, the idea of perfection. And this is a special idea for Descartes, and he needs to show why it's special, and to understand why this idea of God leads to the proof of God, you have to understand just a couple of things which comes out of the medieval metaphysics in which Descartes was steeped. And that has to do with different levels of reality. There is a formal level of reality, what things possess intrinsically. There is an objective reality, that is the kind of reality that's represented by ideas. And it's understood that some things are more real than others. So, for example, you might think of a tower, and you might think of a shadow cast by that tower. And from Descartes' point of view, the shadow is less real than the tower because the tower creates the shadow. And so the idea of the tower has more reality, more objective reality, than the idea of the shadow of the tower, because the things that the ideas are about have different levels of reality. So this can get complicated, but I think the simple element here is that if you think about the idea of God or the idea of perfection, Descartes realizes that this idea represents something with an infinite amount of reality, and he could never have been the source of an idea that is so weighty, that is so powerful, that is so potent. So this idea must have come from outside of his mind, and it in effect proves that it is in reality as well, because the idea of God is so weighty that it couldn't have been made up. It must have come from outside. So the idea of God shows that God exists. Moreover, and we can go through this proof in class, but the other thing that this proof shows Descartes, and this is where we get really to the punchline, is that the being that exists is not a deceiver, that is not evil. Because deception is an imperfection. You probably believe this about your friends and about your teachers, that if they deceive you, they're clearly not perfect. So if the idea of perfection exists, if God exists and is, more or less the idea of perfection, God cannot be a deceiver. And what that means is that when we have clear and distinct ideas in our experience, when it's clear and distinct as Descartes defines those criteria, we can trust it. So we now realize that God exists, that God is no deceiver, and that clear and distinct ideas can be trusted. We have a criteria with which to know our minds and with which to know the external world. So by the end of Meditation 3, Descartes has gotten back his mind, his body, and the world. So this is the key to Meditation 3. It's the proof that the idea of God is one of perfection. It's such a weighty idea that we have no reason that we can doubt it. We have close access to our mind. The idea of perfection is in there. He finds that idea in his mind, and because that idea could only be caused by something with enough reality to cause it, he realizes that God exists. So that's it for Meditations 1 through 3. I've run through it very quickly, and there are maybe questions, lots to discuss, but it definitely sets up the project that Peirce goes about that we will discuss in the next lecture.